So, To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf. I've been meaning to review this one for a while, since a few years that I've read it. Is a modernist novel. Came out in the late 20s, I want to say 1927. I'm caring less and less when the exact date these things came out, or like when who so and so was born. But yeah, I think I mentioned modernism here before. With I want to say D.H. Lawrence, I think, and a little bit of Proust, I think, as well. The basic tenets of it is that it's more subjective, non-linear. It's more about the impact and the individual perception of time, I think, and how main characters process it. Like, say, the narrator of In Search of Lost Time by Marcel Proust, and how his recollections might and like how it's fixated in the whole entire art of the novel is that it's time, and how one grapples with it and the meaning of it, like how certain things might keep going back to you in your childhood too, like they just won't go away, involuntary memory. And similarly with this, Virginia Woolf talks about the Ramsay family and their 8 kids, and how they are going to the lighthouse, and how in the first we get is Ramsay family earlier in the right at the beginning of the novel. This divided into 3 acts. So there's 3 acts, but the acts are very interesting, and I'll discuss that more in depth, because it starts off right when they decide there's a lighthouse when they're in the Isle of Skye in their summer home that they both love to go to. It's a particular scenic view, and I've not been to England, at least in I've only kind of passed through there on flight, but I've never been up there. All the isles and different kind of archipelagos, but I imagine it's quite beautiful, judging from the pictures I've seen of it. Definitely anything to do with kind of the UK or the British Isles and all that is just very it's like a very homely scenic view to all that. So I definitely understand why they chose that as their summer home. And yeah, they're planning on going, but they argue of whether Mr. and Mrs. Ramsay differ a lot, and the driving point that kind of, or I should say the probably first harbinger of kind of that is their disagreement on whether or not it will be the weather will favor them on the day when they want to go to the lighthouse tomorrow. So they're both disagreeing with Mr. Ramsay saying, or Mrs. Ramsay saying, that the weather should be perfectly fine, she says to her son, and because she's more of an optimist by nature, and Mr. Ramsay is like, no, it's like that's not going to be good enough. And this might seem like a kind of a insignificant, kind of inconsequential detail, but it's actually quite important, because later on this becomes they kind of refer back to this dispute, and like that's kind of a mark of their relationship, I think. And yeah, so they end up not going to the lighthouse. It turns out the weather's not good enough, and they end up having a party instead. They invite a bunch of their friends over. There's I think a lady named Mincy. I think there's a man by the name of Hargreaves, I think, or it's Eugene something. I'm blanking on the name, but he's a famous poet, and he's Charles Ramsay is revealed to be an academic of sorts. Like, his whole entire persona is that of him trying to write his magnum opus. Like, that's all his energy is going towards that. It's like a dissertation on something important and right now, like Virginia Woolf's own life, she was married to quite an academic, but also had love affairs with a young lady of an artist, I believe, and that was kind of the catalyst for Mrs. Dalloway, in a sense, which I like to review next sometimes. And also Orlando too. I just finished that, no joke, like a few days ago, and I quite liked it. It was a kind of that same modernist take, but like with from the point of view, except with going through 300 years and changing genders, and kind of an interesting thing. And I did know that there was a movie with Tilda Swinton called Orlando, one of her earlier roles back in the early 90s, I think. And I always knew, kind of heard of that for a while, but I didn't actually know that was a Virginia Woolf story. So I was like, oh, so it kind of piqued my interest. So definitely be looking into that movie. Anyway, back to the story. I only brought that up because the way Woolf kind of tinkers with time is pretty interesting. So basically, at this party that they have, all their friends, and like there's kind of a there's kind of Mr. Ramsay kind of loses it over when the poet asked for a second serving of soup, I think. And then one of Mrs. Ramsay's old comrades are discussing something, I guess. And yeah, so that kind of ends on that. A little bit of sour note. And then 10 years later, it's called, I think it's Time Passes is the name of this section. And that's exactly what happens. 10 years passes, and it's the following aftermath of the First World War, and it's tragedy happens. Mrs. Ramsay is, and Mr. and Mrs. Ramsay have lost their son, Charles. No, not Charles. Charles lives. One of their sons passes in the war. Another one of them dies in having a stillbirth, in childbirth, and yeah, just not a good time for them. And it's just a time of grieving, and they're nothing really to do with the lighthouse actually happens, but there's that kind of referring back to that one, like, remember when we were about to go to the lighthouse, remember we should have gone that time, or we should have. There's like a lot of referring back to, because it's called, the title is called, it's called To the Lighthouse, but it's actually, the interesting thing is that they only visit it really once, and near the end of the story, which I'll get to, and that it's just an interesting thing that I've the title, you'd think it would be something that they just constantly, it's like, yeah, we're going to the lighthouse, time and time again, but it is, but yeah, tragedy happens, it's that's kind of like, that's the furthest thing from their mind, not unlike Virginia Woolf's own life again, with her living through both wars herself too, and losing her own son in the wars, and just the sheer amount of like a mental anguish she experienced with that, falling into a deep depression, and eventually, sadly, taking her own life. I believe she actually tried to take her life on multiple occasions. It might have been 2 to 3 times, I think, before. And then finally, in her 50s, I believe, when she was like mid-50s, I think, in the early 40s, and kind of the midst of the Second World War, obviously, she finally, I think, fell off a cliff, I think. And that, that shadow, you see her kind of hintings of that with To the Lighthouse, with this theme of losing, like a child, family member, or any kind of close one. So, yeah, 10 years later passes again, and this final section is called, finally, To the Lighthouse. So, finally, we get to the meat of the story of the lighthouse itself. 10 years later, their children are pretty much all grown up, and I think it's their Ramsays and their grandchildren, or their grandchildren start to go. Their kids and their are all grown up, obviously, and they're all ready to go to the lighthouse. And it's on more of a, I think it's on a pretty positive note. I think with the Ramsays at this point, they're overcame their grief, and it's past the war time. It's between, it's like, I'm guessing, at the time of the point, it was a good another, at least a decade till like the world was back into the whole unrest and turmoil again. So there's a kind of this theme of the outside world kind of reminded me of what Hess does with it's like the world war is happening, but it's kind of in the background. It's like, the Great Depression is kind of, it's endemic. It's the entire thing. It's happening, but it's more about the individual families and stuff and the individual characters that are developing. In this sense, is Virginia Woolf's family. The Ramsays are just, it's like almost something that, definitely I'm sure is devastating worldwide, the World War, but at the same time it was also more about the it was more about the tertiary, or like the effects of stuff that happened. Like they're obviously losing a son was very tragic, but these things they're like there's like two different ways of looking at them. There's like the individual way of like the close-knit family relationships that Mrs. Ramsey is trying to keep together, and she's like very again, way more of an optimist than Mr. Ramsey, and she might seem to be a little bit nearsighted, or in the sense that she's so narrowly focused on her kids in her little community of local community of friends, and keeping that close knit together. But what that actually does is that differing strongly with Mr. Ramsey, in the sense that he's just trying to create his philosophical kind of masterwork that will outlive him. He's trying to create something that's big, but he's also kind of like absent-minded and, dare say, a little bit almost like uncaring for his family. He never really expresses a lot of emotion, or a lot of like, he's kind of like, oh, I've had these kids, oh, I've had 8 kids, and he's like, it's almost as if it never happened for him, is the kind of an impression that you get from him. He's like very like, it's not like he hates them, but he's just very dispassionate, like absent-minded, intellectual, kind of in his study a lot of the time, not really paying much mind to what happens in the outside world. Whereas Mrs. Ramsey is, she's very aware of the effects of, like, the war and these outside effects and the stuff that's happening, but she's also only insofar as that it helps her protect her family more, and like this well-being of her family is that, and what she's sacrificing everything for. And you start to see it's not a tale of, this is why I love this kind of storytelling, is because it's not about this person's better than that. It's not like saying that Mrs. Ramsey is better than Mr. Ramsey, simply because she cares about like her family more. But it's just that there's a vast difference between perception when it comes down to their linear, subjective, impression of the world. Like Mr. Ramsey's like a lot more in tune with his intellect and all that, and the stuff that will outlive him, in a sense. Maybe this paper that he's writing, his book that he's writing or whatever, will outlive him, and maybe he'll, in a sense, he'll gain some academic scholarly status throughout England, maybe even the world, and who knows, in this fictional realm, which is honestly not too unlike the real world, because I feel like I've crossed paths with people that are kind of like the Ramseys. I say in a way my own family's kind of like the Ramseys, but yeah, it's just, like, it's not wrong, because, I forgot to mention, one of their kids is a poet or a writer, kind of wants to be a writer, and then at one of the there'd be dinner right in the beginning of the novel. This is I don't know why I mentioned this, but Mr. Ramsey's friend, who's kind of like, they're both kind of the same mind, like minds, and he says like something to the effect of like, women can never write, good books, like they'll never be able to, like they're not meant for that, and that kind of like messes with her, because she's like dreaming, she has all these high hopes of being a poet and a artist herself, and then for her own father's friend and kind of his of milieu of academics and all that, they're like, it's like a very kind of male-centric thing, but yeah, I think that, but she ends up like actually trying, like sticking with her gut on that, and becoming, pretty good at it, and this is kind of like, that reminds me of a lot of sort of families too. And yeah, Mrs. Ramsey shows one of the big things. One of my favorite quotes of this, probably of all time, is when she starts talking about the narrator, because the narrator switches around a lot too. Well, not a lot, but it like switches, like sometimes it focuses, sometimes it's from the point of view of like the housemaid that's cares for them or helps care for the Ramseys for years and years, so you get kind of a solidified like objective kind of look into the Ramseys family that's like kind of untainted and touched by like subjective impressions, and then other times you get like really kind of biased, almost kind of more biased assessments of their family. But one of my favorite quotes is like, I think near the end, when Mrs. Ramsey finally pulls off like a good dinner, like that's her main thing, is like, like I've created a good atmosphere, I've had, I've accommodated everybody's needs. And it said like, the narrator says something to the effect of like, it was never, the meaning of life was never about, there was no meaning of life, like, it was about these tiny miracles that Mrs. Ramsey would win throughout the week or throughout the day, or it was about, those little things, those little events that worked out for them, and that was enough. That was enough for the meaning of life. That was for her. That was the meaning of life. That was, and in a sense that, yeah, I just think that's brilliant. Really, the way that you are, the way we gauge our valuations and everything is like drastically different from one to the next. I mean, we do have a collective that I do believe there is something to the collective unconsciousness. I do think we all have elements of maybe both Mr. and Mrs. Ramsey in there, along with their children too, and like the way we have, it's not just like I'm not saying Richard and Woolf is trying to say it's black and white at all. No, it's just, these are two, this is just one way, but I think it's a very far-reaching, it kind of template, because I think of these characters as like, the way, Dostoevsky has characters that represent like a kind of ideology. Like each of these characters kind of represents a way of life, unpacked, I guess. And yeah, that's what I love about it. So I hope I'm not missing anything out there. I feel bad because this was kind of off the cuff, like improv, but if I have any more notes, I'll let you guys know. So thanks for watching.